In 1917, the French army was all but obliterated. America had just joined the war, and the British government wanted to wait for U.S. forces to arrive in number before any new campaigns against the Germans. Haig, however, was eager for another Somme-like battle, only with greater numbers of troops and even worse terrain. Haig lobbied his allies and the British government, though, and got approval for yet another offensive across Flanders, in what would become known as the Battle of Passchendaele. Rather than wait for the American Expeditionary Force, Haig ordered a general attack against the German line. The terrain decisively favored the defenders, with the landscape consisting of wet, muggy, swamp-like conditions made even worse by the moonscape cratering effect of thousands of pieces of artillery. Massive shell holes had filled in with water, and it's certain that more men drowned in this land battle than in any other in history. The absolute slaughter of British forces prompted Winston Churchill to comment that Haig had wore down alike the manhood and guns of the British Army almost to destruction. It's rumored that Haig's chief of staff was driven to the front and upon seeing the terrain for the first time broke into tears and said, "Good God, did we really send men to fight in that?" His driver's response was simple: "It gets worse farther on up." 250,000 British would become casualties in that battle, prompting the British Army to be reduced in strength significantly. Without the intervention of the United States, the entire Western Front would have collapsed in the year to come, securing a German victory. Haig would remain in command of the British Expeditionary Force, but after the war would be lambasted for his failure to understand modern combat and the technological innovations that had forever changed it. Today, while some attempt to defend the man's legacy, most historians agree he remains one of the worst military leaders in human history. Our next worst military leader is best known for his failures after a battle than during it: Erich Ludendorff. Few military leaders have the distinction of being considered amongst the worst military leaders in history for the things they did after the fighting was over, rather than during it. Erich Ludendorff is amongst that number. By all accounts, Ludendorff was a capable, if not superior, military leader during World War I. He oversaw the mostly successful Operation Mikhail, a German offensive that kicked off the German Spring Offensive of 1918. However, he failed to tie together this operation with a grander strategic picture, leaving the Germans with little to show for their battlefield victories. He also helped secure victory against the Russian army at the start of the war in the Battle of Tannenberg. Ludendorff's failures began with his and German General Helmuth von Moltke's alterations to the Schlieffen Plan, which was Germany's plan for victory in a two-front war established in 1905. The plan called for a holding force to simply keep Russian troops at bay while fighting a defensive action. The second part of the plan involved a massive flanking attack on French forces with overwhelming numbers, with an attack wave that would push through the north and then hinge down south into France's defenses. Ludendorff helped weaken the plan by diverting the required troops from the western theater to the east, reducing the required 7-to-1 ratio to secure victory. Ludendorff also helped ensure America's entry into the war by pushing for unrestricted submarine warfare against ships entering British waters, including the merchant and civilian vessels of foreign nations. While the British were indeed hiding supplies inside ships carrying American civilians, unrestricted submarine warfare proved to be a strategic disaster that directly led to the entry of the United States in World War I and Germany's defeat. Cutting Britain off from war supplies was simply not worth the cost of losing the war due to overwhelming American numbers. Ludendorff's real failures, however, came at the end of the war, as the defeated German army was demobilized and sent home. Bristling with anger and indignation, Ludendorff stubbornly held on to the belief that Germany had in fact not been militarily defeated, completely failing to appreciate the strategic weight of America's entry into the war. While he might have been right had the United States not entered the war, the fact is the civilian population was already exhausted from years of war, and the resulting economic collapse of Germany as it shifted to total war mobilization. In fact, many soldiers on the front were eating better than some German civilians, and the war had quickly lost any form of popular support. Undeterred, Ludendorff was instrumental in spreading the stabbed in the back myth, which painted Germany as having been stabbed in the back by the Jews, communists, and other hated minorities. It was them, and not the failure of the German military, that was responsible for losing the First World War. The general quickly became a zealous nationalist and helped set the stage for Hitler and his Nazi party. Despite later disavowing Hitler, Ludendorff had already set the stage for the atrocities of the Nazi party and for World War II. He'd also write a book that helped spur the nation back into a war frenzy, with the Nazis tugs at the leash of the publication of his book, The Total War, which argued that humanity existed in a state of perpetual war and thus nations should remain mobilized for war at all times. Peace was merely a short interim period between wars, and only the nation that remained completely committed to war at all times could ultimately emerge victorious. For helping bring about the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II both, Erich Friedrich Wilhelm Ludendorff has the unique distinction of being one of the worst military leaders in human history. Our next worst military leader was as brilliant as he was unfit for command. George McClellan. Union General George McClellan is a perfect example of assigning the right man for the right job. Unfortunately for the Union during the American Civil War, McClellan was the wrong man for the job. McClellan was a decorated soldier and West Point graduate. He served with distinction during the Mexican-American War and was sent as an observer to the Crimean War, where he learned the importance of logistics for a modern army. This would prompt the genius of the man, as he would learn organizational skills which would be instrumental in the Union's war effort against the rebellious Confederacy in the American Civil War. At the outbreak of war, McClellan was pursued by several states to command their militias, eventually accepting Ohio's offer. A month later, he would be given responsibility for the defense of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and later western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Missouri. 2 weeks later, he was made a major general in the Union Army, second only to Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, General-in-Chief. McClellan immediately took to the task of processing the thousands of volunteers joining the Army, as well as the logistical nightmare of outfitting and equipping the entire Union Army. The succession of the southern states had wreaked havoc on the traditional logistics of the United States Army, and the entire system had to be rebuilt from the ground up. He set up routes of supply from the new sources as well as training camps across the north for the rapidly growing Union Army. McClellan would prove a strategic genius at fixing the logistical issues of the early Union forces, and the men under his command would always enjoy good food, high morale, and plenty of resupply. However, as brilliant as McClellan was in logistics, he was equally timid about battle itself. McClellan scored 2 small victories in the territory that would become West Virginia, and was subsequently summoned to lead the Union Army after its terrible defeat at Bull Run. Having been the only Union general with victories under his belt, no matter how small, McClellan was a national hero. He then spent weeks fortifying the capital against Southern attack, building a series of forts and fortifications that made Washington utterly impregnable to attack. McClellan excelled at construction defenses, but he was absolutely terrified of the Confederacy. General McClellan refused to take offensive operations against the Confederacy due to his belief that the Union was facing a massive army, over 100,000 strong at the time, when in fact the Confederates had struggled to put together 35,000 troops for the offensive in Bull Run. Over and over again, though, through the course of the war, McClellan refused to seize the initiative and push any advantage he discovered, for he always believed he was vastly outnumbered. This growing sense of extreme paranoia wound up robbing the Union of key victories which could have ended the war years before it did, with McClellan once refusing to advance on the Confederate capital despite being close enough to hear the church bells ringing, because he was convinced a far superior force was ready to defend it. In reality, McClellan rarely ever faced a battle where his forces didn't outnumber the enemy 2-1. General Robert E. Lee would eventually figure out McClellan was a very timid commander and use this to his advantage with bold offensives against the Union that relied more on McClellan's paranoia about superior strength than any actual combat ability of the Confederate forces involved. McClellan would work to restore the morale of a seriously demoralized Union army after the staggering defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, but would fail to secure victory against the Confederacy at the Battle of Antietam, believing once more that his strategic position was vastly inferior than it really was. Later, commenters would observe that McClellan's doctrine was extremely sound for a man fighting against a numerically superior foe, but this was not the reality he faced, and all that McClellan's timidness netted him and the Union was an unnecessarily long civil war and a spot amongst the worst military leaders in history. Our next worst military leader was so bad he was directly responsible for the establishment of another military leader as one of the greatest in history, Pierre Charles Jean-Baptiste Sylvestre de Villeneuve, rising to the top of Napoleon's naval ranks simply by virtue of being the only guy left alive. Pierre Charles Villeneuve began his naval career in Napoleon's fleets by commanding one of the only 2 surviving ships from the destruction of the Battle of the Nile. After that, he was captured by the British, where he landed at Malta, and the island fell to the Royal Navy. Villeneuve was eventually released, and with other French admirals dead or having incurred Napoleon's wrath, Villeneuve was suddenly one of the French fleet's most senior officers. He was thus placed in charge of the French fleet at Toulon in 1804, with one simple mission: attack British holdings in the Caribbean so as to draw the British fleet there, thus opening up Britain to invasion over the Channel. With the British distracted in the Caribbean, he was then to rush back to the Channel to defend the French invasion. Villeneuve managed to draw the attention of Horatio Nelson and the British fleet, but then disobeyed orders by sailing for Cadiz instead of the Channel, where he was supposed to keep the Royal Navy out of the Channel as the French army crossed it. Nelson was able to return to the Channel in time to stop Napoleon's plans, and the British fleet would end up in control of the French coast for the remainder of the war. Napoleon ordered Villeneuve to be relieved of command for his disobedience, and upon hearing the news, Villeneuve rashly decided to attack the British fleet directly. The legendary Battle of Trafalgar would result in an overwhelming British victory that established the Royal Navy as the ruler of the high seas for 100 years, and propelled Horatio Nelson's name to legendary status.